Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Wednesday, June 12th, 2019. And today, I am leading the podcast with what I consider to be good news. News that can refresh your belief in the human condition. Because in Arizona, a jury deadlocked and refused to convict the Good Samaritan who gave food, water, and overnight shelter to some immigrants who had moseyed over the border from Mexico. You've probably heard of the case of Scott Warren. He's a 36-year-old college instructor. Geography is his specialty. And he was facing up to 20 years in prison for being a humanitarian. And I want to take a second just to talk about that word. Because remember in February, when the U.S. ginned up this effort to provide humanitarian aid to the starving people of Venezuela? And people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Elliot Abrams were painting the U.S. moves as humanitarian? Well, to me, they're hypocrisy. And a government that would seek to prosecute an American citizen who decided to be a Good Samaritan, to be a humanitarian. Well, it just shows how words can be abused and people can misrepresent their positions. So we have talked about Scott Warren before. He is part of a group there in Arizona called No More Deaths. And this is not the first time that we know of that he took his spare time and some bottles of water and went out to the area near the Mexican border in southern Arizona. And I want to commend the members of this jury. I certainly don't know them. I don't know their mindset. I don't know what, false information they were fed by the prosecutors in this case. But they deadlocked. The judge told them to try again. And then they said, no, we are not going to convict this guy, Your Honor. And the court relented. And Scott Warren is, at least at the moment, a free man. Outside the courthouse, he thanked his supporters, criticized the government. Today it remains as necessary as ever for local residents and humanitarian aid volunteers to stand in solidarity with migrants and refugees. And we must also stand for our families, friends, and neighbors in the very land itself most threatened by the militarization of our borderland communities. Warren has said his case could set a dangerous precedent by expanding the definition of the crimes of transporting and harboring migrants to include people merely trying to help border crossers. And he was charged under conspiracy laws. Conspiracy to transport and harbor migrants. Now, this sends a powerful message that there are average Americans who reject the hate message of Donald Trump, the denigration of immigrants, and the idea that all of our immigration issues are focused on the southern border. And, by extension, I would argue that they're acknowledging that the entire immigration crisis is a political concoction because the Republicans benefit every day that the news brings you information about more borders, more people trying to cross the border. They don't want to fix it. They want to exploit the misery and the suffering of these individuals. And there are plenty of Americans who buy into it. It makes them feel superior. It allows them to release the ugly feelings and thoughts that they often suppress. And, frankly, it is designed to make them feel superior so that they'll turn around and vote for Trump again. Activists in New York City have set up cages in 20 or more locations. These are chain-link fenced cages like the ones that were used to separate migrant children from their parents last year. And these cages include dummies or mannequins of children. And I support this use of artistic expression in a public space to provoke awareness and reflection. And maybe people will stand up and say, "You are doing this, but not in my name," and show their disapproval. You may have heard yesterday Trump was talking about the secret deal he has with Mexico. Reporters were skeptical. So Trump he was on his way to the helicopter, and he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. And it turns out that it was a document related to Mexico and the border negotiations. It was kind of his Cliff's Notes. And we know that Trump doesn't like to read. They brief him orally, verbally, or videoly, but he doesn't like paper. And a resourceful photographer, a lensman for the Washington Post, Jabin Botsford, he turned on his telephoto lens, and he was able to decipher a great deal of the text in this document that Trump pulled out of his pocket. Here's a quote from it. "If the U.S. determines at its discretion and after consultation with Mexico after 45 calendar days from the date of the issuance of the joint declaration that the measures adopted by Mexico have not sufficiently achieved results in addressing the flow of migrants to the southern border of the United States, the government of Mexico will take all necessary steps under the domestic law to bring the government into force with a view to ensuring that the agreement will enter into force within 45 days. Now, I don't know about you, but as I read that, it kind of meanders, and I'm not sure what it really says. But it does appear that this is an actual briefing paper for the president. There are signatures on it, but they're not from high-level people. One, the American, is an acting legal advisor in the State Department, and the other signature is expected or thought to be the deputy legal advisor in Mexico's foreign ministry. And so we'll wait for the official document to be rolled out, but it does show that the New York Times got it wrong when they said that this was just a rehash of previous agreements. And it does appear that Mexico is working to avoid being saddled with this third country asylum deal where, they have to house people who are applying for asylum in the United States, and somebody from El Salvador has to apply in Guatemala and stay there. This overlooks the real danger that people who are fleeing Central American countries face. It trivializes it. There's another story today of a woman who clearly qualified for asylum, but we have rejected her, and we're sending her back to Honduras, where she faces almost certain death. And words fail me because the idiocy of the policies, the unnecessary nature of this whole crisis, and the impact on real, live human beings is just overwhelming. And so it goes. In Hong Kong, violence has erupted on day 4 of the protests. 1 million people took to the streets on Sunday, protesting an extradition bill that would allow people from Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China to face criminal prosecution. Now, this proposal is supported by Carrie Lam. She is the Beijing-appointed leader of Hong Kong. Her term is up next year. She is straddling a fine line. Clearly, despite her denials, Beijing wants this extradition bill. She wants to give it to them because she wants to hang on to her job. And according to the news accounts, it was the protesters who started the violence. They stormed police barricades outside the Legislative Council. They hurled bricks, bottles, and umbrellas at the officers, and the riot police responded with rubber bullets, beanbag rounds, and tear gas canisters. I've been to Hong Kong a couple of times. It's a fascinating place. And I do respect the aspirations of the people there to maintain some sort of arm's length from the Chinese government in Beijing. But they don't have much leverage, and you can't expect the beacon of liberty here in the United States to shine in the direction of Hong Kong these days. Last week, I released an in-depth interview with Danny Serson. Retired Army major, he taught history at West Point. He really impressed me. And I invited him to become a regular on the podcast. I'll be interviewing him in another couple of months, probably. And he said, I am prolific, watch out. And just since last week, he has written 3 or 4 columns that have been posted. The latest at antiwar.com, entitled A Soldier's Defense of Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. He opens, it's a matter of principles over personalities. Whether one loves or hates Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange is beside the point. In this case, the government's tool for oppression is the Espionage Act. For the first time ever, they are attempting to imprison an actual publisher, Julian Assange, charged on 17 counts under the Espionage Act. He faces extradition and a lengthy sentence in the United States. And Serson says, I've been called a whistleblower myself for my decision to write a book and articles critical of the American warfare state and the military to which I dedicated my entire life from the age of 17. But the truth is, I've got nothing on Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. Manning broke the law, risked it all, went to prison for her principles. Assange is headed for the same fate. And as a soldier, I'm glad they did what they did. Now, this is a courageous voice. I'd like to see more present and former service members speak out. He continues, Manning's leak exposed serious war crimes, including Army helicopters shooting and killing Reuters journalists. For me, there was one aspect of the WikiLeaks revelations that was most vindicating. All through 2006 and 2007, when I was serving a brutal 15-month tour in Iraq, senior Army generals and just about every cretin in the Bush administration repeatedly denied that the country had descended into a sectarian civil war. The thing is, that was a lie. And both General Casey and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld knew it. Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange exposed what we on the ground already knew to be true. And Serson continues, see, I take it personal. The lies Washington told about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was 27 months of my life, stolen, 8 of my soldiers killed, so much of my conscience forever bruised. Thus, I choose to stand with the lawbreakers this time around. After all, my oath was to the Constitution, not to any specific legal statute or any individual president. Personally, I have my own reservations about Assange in particular, but that hardly matters now. Military men ought to be thanking both he and Chelsea Manning for exposing some of the most damning aspects of the unwinnable, unnecessary wars they had to fight. So consider this a desperate plea from a career soldier. Pay attention. Defend those who subvert the military and government secrecy regulations. In such times, real patriotism involves breaking the rules. Well said, Danny. Absolutely well said. At Consortium News today, journalist Daniel Lazar asks, why didn't Mueller investigate Seth Rich? And he runs through the litany of what happened in the summer of 2016, July 10, 4 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Rich was found shot to the back, according to the police report, on a street in the Bloomingdale neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And the initial accounts from his mother, his hands were bruised, her knees are bruised, his face is bruised. He had 2 shots to his back. They never took anything. They took his life for literally no reason. His brother said that after being shot, that Seth Rich was very aware, very talkative, when police found him lying on the pavement, but cops have refused to say if he described his assailant. And a month later, the police put out a statement. There is no indication that Seth Rich's death is connected to his employment at the Democratic National Committee. Now, the point here, And Lazar is clear about it. We don't know what role Seth Rich may have played. We know he was in contact with WikiLeaks. We know that Assange has made some kind of furtive statements, including offering a $20,000 reward for the killer. For the identification of the killer of Seth Rich. And Lazar writes, all the Mueller report did was replace one conspiracy theory with another involving the Kremlin and its minions that is equally unconvincing. There's nothing in the Mueller report indicating that the special counsel independently reviewed the forensic evidence or questioned family members. He didn't interview Assange. He didn't talk to Craig Murray, the former British ambassador. And Murray says Mueller's team made no effort to contact him, even though he has publicly stated that he met with an associate of the leaker near American University in Washington, D.C. And since Assange himself consistently maintained the data was the result of an inside leak rather than an internal hack, why is it that in the limited hangout investigation by St. Bob Mueller that there are assertions where he flatly claims that Assange is misleading, but doesn't offer any true refutation of that? So I recommend this article, as I have maintained all along. There are so many leads that Mueller did not pursue that this is not a full or credible investigation. And his unproven assertion that there was this sweeping Russian effort, which by the end of his statement delivered a couple of weeks ago, is reduced to a series of allegations. It's a mess. And the whole Russiagate saga has had quite an impact on certain people with a background linked to Russia. And today I'm releasing a powerful in-depth interview with journalist and author Yasha Levine. And he shares some very personal experiences as a Soviet Jew who emigrated to the United States, landing in San Francisco at the age of 9. And he says because he was Jewish and the whole context of his family's emigration, that he felt kind of special and he bought into the American dream up to a point. But Russiagate changed that. And now all Russians are suspects. They're thought to be moles. They're all personal agents who report directly to Vladimir Putin. Here's an excerpt from my in-depth conversation with Yasha Levine.
It's quite a switch, from in 1987, the march, this sort of big march on Washington by American Jews and American supporters, which included, a speech by Vice President George H.W. Bush, which called on the Soviet Union to let our people go, basically as Moses, George H.W. Bush as Moses telling Gorbachev to let our people go, and saying that these people deserve protection. These people are special. Let them go. Free them from bondage. Free them from Soviet bondage. And it's a contrast to today, where you're seen as a possible threat by the media, where you're seen. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what hour of the day you turn on CNN or MSNBC. It's nonstop.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Yasha Levine, released to my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, or whatever they call it now, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher. And one of the digressions that we take is a discussion of how Yasha Levine's father listened to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and they were very distinct broadcasts. Radio Liberty was run by the CIA and was much more of a propaganda organ. And one of the comments I made that Levine agreed with is that Russiagate is basically feeding Radio Liberty to Americans. That'll make more sense when you listen to the full interview. So I am marking 10 years of podcasting this week. We started in June of 2009 after I had wound up my syndicated radio program. And already people have gotten in touch for my invitation to check in as kind of a census. Do we really reach 71 countries, as Google Analytics tells me? Well, we've got a few countries. Plenty here in the United States. Here is Mad Ed, who says, what I love about your show is your even temper and informed skepticism. Even your rants wouldn't be out of place at a dinner party. Well, thank you, Ed. He says, you just seem really level-headed. Your colleagues in the business often come off as hysterical, even Tom Hartman. But you're always very cool. How do you do it? Well, Mad Ed, it's people like you who enable me to maintain my composure. And here's Jason Spitzer in San Jose. He said, I've been listening to you since the 80s on FM, and then you went to KGO, and then the podcast. I discovered KXRA too late to catch that. I appreciate your trenchant, often counter-corporate media narrative analysis of the news and developments, your unwavering journalistic, uncompromising moral standards, and overall fearlessness in defending truth. Well, thank you, Jason. He also enjoyed our review of the San Francisco punk rock scene with Jack Bulware, which goes back a year or two. Man, let's see. Oh, here's Brian Carey. First heard you on Who, What, Why, and soon realized your podcasts were superior. Downloaded your podcast, have been listening daily for about a year. And Brian is a subscriber. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Here is Aidan McAleer on the west coast of Ireland near Bundoran, County Donegal. I first heard about you via Newsbud. Well, that goes back to about 2016. Thank you very much, Aidan. Here is Rob Slaney in Melbourne, Australia. He says, your speaking tempo is genuine. Those poor journalists who are told to speak at a cracking word-per-minute pace are wearing to listen to at the witching hour when I listen to your show. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. Here's Romeo in Montreal. I appreciate your journalistic rigor, courageous outspokenness, and principle. When I lean toward disagreeing with something you say, I'm inclined to give thought to your viewpoint and quite often come around. Wow. I'm glad I can be so persuasive, Romeo. And let's see. Let me just grab one more here, and we'll do this every day for the next couple of weeks. And anybody who checks in, I will try to include your comments. Where did Paul go? Here it is. Paul Elsesser. I've been with you since the start of the podcast, discovered you when you still had your radio station in Monterey. I believe I was one of the first subscribers to not use PayPal and to pay you directly. I generally listen when I'm walking my dogs, Squirt and Grover. I like all your podcasts, but especially the interviews. I've read so many good books by your guests that I've lost count. Well, thanks to each and every one of you. Those greetings warm my heart, give me an idea of who's out there and just how sprawling this podcast audience is, and I'm deeply gratified. And many of these people are already subscribers, so I'm not going to pitch them. I'm not asking people to take out multiple subscriptions like some generous folks have. But if you're not a subscriber, you know what to do. Visit peterbcollins.com, click menu, click Become a Subscriber, and you can take it from there. Over at consortiumnews.com, another good article today from our friend John Kiriakou, and he reports that John Bolton could be the next to be ejected from the Trump White House. Now, there's been quite a revolving door there, but based on his insider contacts of both parties in Washington, Kiriakou says, I believe his days are numbered for reasons that have all played out in the press. I've linked to his article, and you can get the lowdown on the three reasons that Kiriakou thinks that Bolton is on his way out. What I am not so sanguine about is his closer here. He says Mick Mulvaney, Trump's acting chief of staff, has very quietly and discreetly begun informal meetings with a list of a half dozen possible replacements for Bolton. Let's hope he finds one that he and Trump both like sooner rather than later. Well, my experience is when a really ugly political appointee steps down, they find somebody even worse to replace that person with. So I'd be happy to see Bolton go, but I shudder to think who Trump thinks his replacement should be. Trump is lashing out at pollsters because he doesn't like the findings they report. One of the reports that is based on an apparent leak is that internal polling by the Trump campaign shows that he's in deep trouble for a 2020 re-elect. And a new Quinnipiac poll with 1,200 voters nationwide shows that Biden could beat Trump by 13 points, Bernie can beat him by 9, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren lead Trump by 9 and 8 points, Pete Buttigieg, and even Senator Cory Booker each came in 5 points ahead of Trump. So that spells some real problems, and that means he's got to crank up the Twitter machine. He has to deepen the divisions among Americans, with or without help from Putin. And I find that an interesting snapshot. Another recent poll shows that 40% of Americans would rather live in a socialist country than a capitalist one. And younger women are the lead cell of voters who hold that opinion. So this I find very interesting. Mostly people under 50 don't have the Cold War notion that all socialism is evil. And that could help Bernie Sanders, who's giving a speech tonight at George Washington University to try to once again define his version of democratic socialism. And he is going to describe it as a platform of economic rights. And I support that. I think he needs to better help people understand what he means. And I've advised before that Sanders should describe socialism or socialist ideas as the corrective for runaway capitalism. We're not going to have state ownership of business or industry or a command economy. It's a matter of economic fairness. And Sanders articulates that part very well. But he hasn't been as effective in describing socialism in a way that is accessible, honest, but also has the kind of components that I just suggested, that most people know that capitalism is out of control. And that's what socialism can help correct. Sanders also, to his credit, has spoken up, arguing for the release from prison of former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, shorthand Lula. And we have reported on the Intercept's blockbuster investigation. They got text messages that show that the investigator, the prosecutor, who put Lula behind bars before he could run for re-election last year, a man named Sergio Moro, who is now the top prosecutor, the attorney general of the nation of Brazil under the right-wing Bolsonaro government. Now, the hardest part here is that Brazil is so corrupt that hundreds of members of the national legislature have been accused of corruption. The car wash investigation exposed how the Brazilian state oil company was this cash cow that was used in many different ways. Many people held their noses and voted for Bolsonaro just because he had promised to clean up the corruption. Now that they've learned that he got into power through a corrupt process, it's hard to know how Brazil can ever really right the ship. And at an event today in Brazil, Sergio Moro was seen at a ceremony in Brasilia, the capital, with Bolsonaro. And they're both tight-lipped, a lot of pressure on Moro to resign. Just before showtime, I checked, and the Missouri and Mississippi and Arkansas rivers are still at flood levels. There are more than 200 gauges along the river basin there that show flood levels or greater. And this is going to produce an even larger dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico this summer because the river water creates algae that dies and decomposes. And this leads to hypoxic areas or low oxygen, and they anticipate that that could reach as many as 8,700 square miles in the Gulf of Mexico this summer. Now, BP, the company responsible for the 2010 blowout of the Deepwater Horizon oil platform in the Gulf, they have a new report that they took public. Now, consider the source. BP, one of the largest oil and gas extractors in the world. And they are concerned that because of the extreme weather events, that people are using more carbon. When it's cold, we turn on the heat. When it's hot, we turn on the air conditioning. We're just easing out of a heat wave here in the Bay Area. And we've had all of our utilities, operating at the max. And Spencer Dale, the chief economist at BP, said the increase in the number of extreme weather events and increasing demand for energy could be a vicious cycle. If there's a link between the growing levels of carbon in the atmosphere and types of weather patterns, this would raise the possibility of a vicious cycle, increasing levels of carbon leading to more extreme weather, which in turn triggers stronger growth in energy as households and businesses try to offset their effects. And he said the report reveals a growing mismatch between rising demand for climate action and the actual pace of progress. Now, the agenda here is that BP controls a lot of natural gas. Their enemy is coal. And we actually have seen an uptick in the burning of coal despite the reduction in the number of power plants in the United States over the past 2 years. That would be a Trump effect. I don't know who conducted this study, but it was published at a website linked to the Smithsonian Institution. And it shows the funding from 2003 to 2010 of the agencies that have promoted skepticism of climate change. Donors Trust Capital was the biggest donor, $78 million. The Scaife-affiliated foundations, that's Richard Mellon Scaife out of Pittsburgh. The Bradley Foundation. The Koch Foundations. The Howard Foundation. The John William Pope Foundation. The Searle Freedom Trust. And the list goes on. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. Payback is a bitch. You know that Nancy Pelosi has zinged Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook for not taking down that doctored video of her appearing to slur her words. Well, now somebody is getting even with Mark Zuckerberg. And they used a deepfake process to create a video that appears to be a scene in Zuckerberg's office in Menlo Park. I've actually not been in the office, but I've walked right past it and looked in the picture windows. And they created a script that kind of sounds like Zuck, and he makes a pretty astounding claim. Take a listen.
Imagine this for a second. One man with total control of billions of people's stolen data, all their secrets, their lives, their futures. I owe it all to Spectre. Spectre showed me that whoever controls the data controls the future.
So, Facebook has said that it's going to treat this video like it treated the Pelosi video. And it was originally posted at Instagram. I believe it's now on the Facebook platform. And they say if third-party fact-checkers mark it as false, we will filter it from Instagram's recommendation surfaces. I saw the Pelosi video a lot. I don't notice any filtering that occurred there.
It's quite a switch, from in 1987, the march, this sort of big march on Washington by American Jews and American supporters, which included, a speech by Vice President George H.W. Bush, which called on the Soviet Union to let our people go, basically as Moses, George H.W. Bush as Moses telling Gorbachev to let our people go, and saying that these people deserve protection. These people are special. Let them go. Free them from bondage. Free them from Soviet bondage. And it's a contrast to today, where you're seen as a possible threat by the media. where you're seeing, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what hour of the day you turn on CNN or MSNBC. It's nonstop.
And finally, I am very disappointed to see that the New York Times has decided to stop running all political cartoons. Now, they got burned in their international edition by running an anti-Semitic cartoon a few months ago. And I'm particularly upset that Patrick Chapat, or Chapate, who is a very ingenious political cartoonist, he did a series of cartoons about visiting San Quentin that still are very fresh in my memory. Anyway, the Times has decided that political cartoons, I guess, aren't worth it. And once again, they've made a big blunder. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it far and wide. I hope you will. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to